By the spring of 1944, the situation for Nazi Germany had become increasingly desperate. Critical supplies were running low, the Eastern Front was consuming enormous resources, and now the Western Allies were preparing for the invasion Europe had anticipated for years. Yet despite the mounting pressure, Adolf Hitler still viewed the coming battle with confidence. His strategy was straightforward: strengthen the Atlantic defenses, smash the Allied landings with a violent counterattack, and drive the invaders back into the Channel. Once that was done, Germany could supposedly focus entirely on crushing the Soviet Union. In Hitler's mind, the campaign in Normandy would decide the fate of the war.
In the earlier part of this D-Day series, the focus was on the air war over Normandy. This chapter turns to the brutal fighting on the ground that ultimately determined whether the invasion would succeed or collapse. Why did some beaches become scenes of slaughter while others were captured comparatively quickly? Why did German armored counterattacks fail to destroy the invasion force? And why did the Allies struggle for weeks before finally breaking out across France? To explore those questions, the Royal Armoury's Jonathan Ferguson helped examine some of the most significant weapons used during the invasion, though more on that later. The foundation for Operation Overlord was originally created by Lieutenant General Sir Frederick E. Morgan, a figure many people have never heard of. Serving as Cossack, Morgan drafted the first complete invasion plan for Western Europe. Normandy was selected as the landing zone, while an enormous deception campaign was designed to convince Germany that the main invasion would strike the Pas-de-Calais instead. Airborne troops would secure the flanks of the landing area, with American forces landing on the western beaches and British and Commonwealth troops assaulting the eastern sectors. Rather than immediately capturing a major port, Morgan proposed an innovative solution: transporting two enormous prefabricated harbors across the English Channel to sustain the invasion force after the landings. When General Dwight D. Eisenhower became Supreme Commander and Bernard Montgomery took command of Allied ground forces in December 1943, responsibility for Overlord passed to them. Their main alteration to Morgan's original concept was expanding both the airborne assaults and the amphibious landings across a wider front. The city of Caen became the first major objective, followed later by the port of Cherbourg. Montgomery anticipated that once the landing succeeded, the Germans would eventually withdraw toward defensive positions along the Seine River within 3 months. Even so, nobody expected the campaign to be easy. The divisions selected for the invasion were reinforced with specialized equipment and additional units. American, British, and Commonwealth troops were supplied with DD tanks, duplex-drive amphibious tanks capable of swimming ashore. The British, however, also deployed unusual specialist armored vehicles designed specifically for the invasion. Rather than fighting enemy tanks directly, these vehicles existed to support infantry by destroying bunkers, pillboxes, and defensive fortifications. Many belonged to the famous group nicknamed Hobart's Funnies, developed under Major General Sir Percy Hobart. One of the most distinctive was the Churchill AVRE, an armored engineering vehicle equipped with a massive spigot mortar instead of a traditional tank cannon. This weapon could fire huge explosive charges capable of demolishing fortified positions. The vehicle could also carry specialized equipment to help troops move inland from the beaches, including small bridges, giant canvas rolls laid across soft sand, and massive bundles of wood used to fill trenches and ditches. As Britain filled with Allied troops preparing for invasion, including an entirely fictitious army group intended to fool German intelligence, the Germans worked frantically to strengthen the Atlantic Wall. By 1944, the German Navy and Luftwaffe were shadows of their former strength, meaning the defense of Western Europe rested mainly on the German army. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B, believed Germany's only realistic chance of stopping the invasion was to destroy the Allies immediately at the coastline before they could establish a foothold. Although construction of the Atlantic Wall had begun in 1942, the fortifications were still incomplete. Starting in early 1944, Rommel dramatically accelerated the work, overseeing the addition of bunkers, artillery emplacements, beach obstacles, and millions of mines, many concentrated in Normandy. The German units defending these positions varied enormously in quality. While Germany technically had 58 divisions stationed in the West by May 1944, many consisted of understrength garrison troops whose best soldiers had already been transferred eastward. The true striking power of the German defense rested with 9 panzer divisions and 1 panzergrenadier division, together fielding around 1,400 tanks and self-propelled guns. However, Rommel did not control them directly. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and General Leo Gehr von Schweppenberg disagreed sharply with Rommel's defensive ideas. They favored holding the armored reserves farther inland for a large mobile counterattack, while Rommel insisted the tanks needed to remain close to the beaches. He understood that Allied air superiority would make large-scale troop movements extremely dangerous once the invasion began. More importantly, he believed that if the Allies secured a stable beachhead, their overwhelming industrial strength would eventually crush Germany through sheer attrition. After the disagreement reached Hitler, an awkward compromise emerged. Of the available armored divisions, Rommel received only 3 under his direct influence. 4 remained under Schweppenberg's reserve command, while 3 others were stationed farther south with Army Group G. Hitler also insisted that the reserve armored formations could not move without his personal approval. That decision would severely cripple the German response on D-Day. Originally, the invasion was scheduled for June 5, 1944. Terrible weather across the Channel forced Eisenhower to delay the operation by 24 hours, a difficult and risky choice because any postponement threatened the secrecy of the invasion. Meteorologists eventually predicted a short break in the storm conditions, and based on that forecast Eisenhower gave the final order: the invasion would proceed on June 6. Before departing for Normandy, thousands of Allied soldiers received a personal message from Eisenhower. In the letter, he admitted that the mission ahead would be difficult and acknowledged that the enemy was experienced, heavily armed, and battle-hardened. Yet he also expressed complete confidence in the courage, discipline, and skill of the Allied troops, declaring that nothing short of total victory would be acceptable. Among those preparing for the invasion was Major James Robert Morgan of the British 12th Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment. Writing to his wife on the back of Eisenhower's message, he described himself humorously as looking like Father Christmas beneath all his equipment and binoculars. Despite the danger ahead, he wrote with optimism, saying he looked forward to the coming hours and asking her to save tomatoes for him when he returned home. He urged her to keep the letter as a memory of what he believed would become one of history's great moments. The first Allied troops to reach Normandy were British and Canadian airborne forces from the 6th Airborne Division, arriving east of Sword Beach by parachute and glider. Their mission focused on capturing crucial bridges over the Caen Canal and the River Orne. Although many units landed scattered across the countryside, they successfully seized their objectives. Holding those bridges, however, would require lightly armed airborne troops to repel German armored attacks. Jonathan Ferguson later explained one of the weapons used in these desperate defensive actions: the PIAT, or projector infantry anti-tank weapon. Despite the common belief that it functioned like a giant spring-powered catapult, it was actually a spigot mortar fired from the shoulder. The heavy spring existed mainly to absorb recoil. Ferguson described how the weapon used the Monroe effect to penetrate armor and recounted the famous defense of Pegasus Bridge. According to Major John Howard, Sergeant Thornton managed to approach a German tank close enough to fire a decisive PIAT shot, destroying the vehicle outright. The Germans reportedly believed they had encountered anti-tank artillery and halted their assault, potentially saving the bridge from being overrun. Farther west, the American 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions landed behind Utah Beach on the Cotentin Peninsula. Their task was to seize roads and exits leading inland, enabling troops from the beach landings to advance toward Cherbourg. The airborne assault quickly descended into confusion. Thick clouds disrupted navigation, causing many Pathfinder teams to miss their targets, while others struggled to activate their radar beacons after landing. Entire units became scattered across Normandy. One example was the 2nd Battalion of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, much of which landed in the wrong area and spent most of D-Day trying to regroup. Yet despite the chaos, many isolated soldiers improvised effectively, forming ad hoc groups made up of men from completely different units who still managed to complete important objectives. Among the paratroopers who jumped into Normandy was 29-year-old Sergeant Floyd Corrington of Dog Company, 506th PR, 101st Airborne Division. He wore a particular helmet during the flight aboard a C-47 transport aircraft alongside Lieutenant Ronald Spears. Very little is known about Corrington's movements after he landed, but he was later reported killed in action on D-Day. His helmet was eventually discovered near the hamlet of Bas Addeville, south of Drop Zone C, where his unit had originally intended to land. Today, Corrington rests in the Normandy American Cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer. Although the American airborne operations failed to unfold according to plan, they caused widespread confusion among German defenders and successfully secured the exits from Utah Beach. By then, Allied naval guns and aircraft had begun bombarding the coastal defenses. The sheer volume of firepower was enormous, though the effectiveness varied greatly. Any German strongpoints left intact would inflict devastating casualties. At Utah Beach, the landings unfolded with remarkable success. The invasion force accidentally came ashore farther south than planned in a lightly defended area. Allied commanders immediately exploited the mistake, and by 10 o'clock that morning organized resistance had largely collapsed. Only 197 casualties were suffered. Several miles east, however, Omaha Beach became a nightmare. Of all 5 invasion beaches, Omaha posed the greatest challenge. The 6-mile stretch was overlooked by steep bluffs nearly 150 feet high, giving German defenders commanding fields of fire over beaches crowded with mines, obstacles, and barbed wire. Only 5 narrow gullies allowed movement inland, and the Germans had transformed each into a deadly killing zone. Jonathan Ferguson later examined the MG-42 machine gun, perhaps the weapon most associated with Omaha Beach. Designed as a universal machine gun, the MG-42 excelled in defensive combat thanks to its belt-fed ammunition system and quick-change barrel. Ferguson explained how relatively small numbers of German soldiers armed with these weapons could hold back vastly larger Allied formations. He mentioned the account of Heinrich Severloh, who later claimed to have killed enormous numbers of American troops during the battle for Omaha. While historians debate the exact figures, there is no doubt the MG-42 served as a terrifying force multiplier during the invasion. The Allies had hoped that heavy naval shelling and strategic bombing would annihilate the German defenses before the first assault waves arrived at 6:30 a.m. Instead, much of the bombardment missed its targets, leaving many fortifications untouched. Conditions worsened when most of the DD tanks launched offshore by the 741st Tank Battalion sank in rough seas. Out of 32 tanks launched, 27 disappeared beneath the water. The infantry faced disasters of their own. Strong currents and rough seas scattered landing craft, some of which flooded and drowned the heavily burdened soldiers inside. Others struck sandbars, forcing troops to wade through deep water under constant enemy fire. The casualties mounted rapidly. At one point, General Omar Bradley seriously considered abandoning Omaha altogether and redirecting future troops toward Utah Beach. Slowly, however, isolated groups of American soldiers began finding weaknesses in the German defenses. By evening, the situation finally stabilized. Around 34,000 troops had landed at Omaha, though at a terrible cost, more than 2,400 killed, wounded, or missing, the highest losses suffered on any invasion beach. 1 hour after the Americans landed, British, Canadian, and Free French troops came ashore farther east at Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches. At Gold Beach, the British 50th Division encountered heavy resistance and failed to secure every objective despite advancing inland. Canadian troops at Juno pushed farther into Normandy than any other Allied formation on D-Day, fighting brutal house-to-house battles. At Sword Beach, the assault generally unfolded according to plan. Sword benefited from the strongest naval bombardment supporting any of the 5 beaches. Most DD tanks successfully reached shore alongside the infantry, immediately providing fire support. Hobart's specialized armored vehicles began clearing mines and obstacles almost at once, using their unusual equipment to fill trenches and destroy strongpoints. Although many vehicles were knocked out, surviving crews continued their work manually under fire. Within 2 hours, 7 of the 8 beach exits had been opened. Even so, the fighting remained fierce. One heavily defended position at Sword, codenamed Cod, required 3 hours to capture and inflicted 25% casualties on the attacking battalions. Nevertheless, by the end of D-Day nearly 29,000 troops had landed there successfully. During the opening stages of the invasion, the Allies generally overwhelmed the overstretched and underprepared German defenders everywhere except Omaha. The major unanswered question now involved the German armored response. Remarkably, the invasion fleet crossing the Channel on June 5 passed largely undetected because poor weather had convinced the Germans no invasion was imminent. Rommel was away visiting family in Germany, while several senior commanders in Normandy happened to be attending an anti-invasion exercise elsewhere. The first significant German counterattack came later on D-Day itself. The 21st Panzer Division advanced between British and Canadian positions and briefly reached the coastline. However, poor decisions, communication failures, and overwhelming Allied firepower stopped the attack. More than half of the division's 124 tanks were lost. The rest of Germany's armored reserves remained under Hitler's personal authority. Unfortunately for the Germans, Hitler slept late after working through the night and was unavailable for hours. Even after learning about the invasion, both Hitler and Rundstedt remained convinced Normandy might only be a diversion before the real invasion at Calais. Eventually, portions of Panzer Group West received permission to move toward Normandy, but valuable time had already been wasted. Germany's opportunity for a coordinated full-scale counterattack was slipping away. Meanwhile, the Allies struggled primarily with logistics. Until the Mulberry harbors became operational, supplies had to be unloaded directly onto the beaches using amphibious trucks known as ducks, or ducks. These vehicles proved extremely useful, though rough waters complicated operations. Rising tides created further chaos by compressing men and equipment into crowded beachheads vulnerable to artillery fire. These delays severely slowed the British advance toward Caen. Traffic jams, strongpoints, and difficult terrain prevented the city from falling on D-Day as planned. Instead, Caen remained in German hands for another 6 weeks. Despite failing to secure every objective, the invasion itself had succeeded. By June 7, approximately 156,000 Allied troops had landed in Normandy. The beachhead expanded steadily while the Germans struggled to organize an effective response. Allied aircraft dominated the skies, relentlessly attacking German columns attempting to reach the front. Many German units could move only at night. At the same time, French resistance fighters sabotaged transportation networks and slowed reinforcements, often suffering brutal reprisals from German forces in return. All of these factors delayed and weakened the German counteroffensive. The strongest German effort came from the 12th SS Panzer Division, which attacked the Canadian 3rd Division shortly after D-Day. However, the Canadians possessed enormous artillery support, including self-propelled Sexton guns armed with 25-pounder artillery pieces. Combined with naval gunfire from offshore warships, the Allies unleashed overwhelming firepower that shattered German attacks. When the Panzer Lehr Division arrived to reinforce the fighting 2 days after D-Day, the initiative had already passed to the Allies. Instead of launching a decisive counterattack, German armored units were forced into defensive positions to block Allied advances toward Caen. On June 12, Allied troops captured Corentin, finally linking all 5 invasion beaches into a single continuous front. Every day afterward brought fresh waves of Allied soldiers, tanks, fuel, and ammunition into Normandy. Any realistic hope of driving the invasion back into the sea had vanished. Hitler's opportunity to destroy the landings was gone forever. The Western Allies had successfully carried out the largest combined air, land, and sea operation in military history. The achievement depended on detailed planning, overwhelming industrial resources, and the extraordinary courage of the men who fought there, combined with critical German failures at every level of command. Although D-Day itself was not the ultimate turning point of the Second World War, it marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Within less than a year, advancing Allied armies from east and west would crush the Third Reich completely and finally bring Hitler's regime to destruction.